at the moment. So when I look at it, and it's, one of the things I did, or rather didn't do, after leaving office, was I purposely didn't speak to European leaders that I knew very well. I didn't want to undermine in any way the government's negotiating position when it was negotiating the withdrawal agreement, or indeed when it was negotiating the Windsor framework. I stayed out of it because there's always the problem that people might think you're a back channel or what have you. So I stopped those relationships. And I think it's been interesting coming back to see how it's working and how problems are being fixed and opportunities are being taken. I think a lot of the heat and anger has come out of the relationship. It's now much more functional, and I think it's functioning well.
Very good, thank you. Well, let's take off now into more specific areas. Lord Lamont.
Good afternoon, Foreign Secretary. In our last report, this committee recommended that the UK and the EU deepen and improve its relationship on foreign and security affairs. It also proposed limited structured arrangements, which the Foreign Office wasn't so keen on. I suppose it depends very much what one means by structured. But I don't think anyone meant joining the CSFP or having a large bureaucracy or anything like that. But do you really believe that ad hoc coordination just when issues arise is really going to be sufficient to address long-term strategic issues such as China, such as Gaza?
I'm a very practical person, and I think what matters is what works. And I would argue that, the biggest challenge we've had is Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine. And that has been, I think, in terms of the British and European and NATO and international response, a huge success. And I would say the way that the UK's worked with the EU and others in that time, it's developed its own structure. So it's not unstructured, but it's been ad hoc arrangements put in place, whether it is delivering military capability, whether it's delivering training, whether it's the sanctions regime, the separate aspects of coordination, all of them have worked very well. So, look, one should never rule things out and say we wouldn't look at this idea or that idea, but I think that the flexibility you have to meet a challenge by putting together, is it the G7, is it UK, EU, is it a NATO partnership? That flexibility really helps. And I haven't really seen, I can think of all sorts of things we could do to improve our own performance when it comes to perhaps defence production to provide more weapons to Ukraine. But I think that the coordination internationally done in this ad hoc way has been very effective.
Thank you very much. Could I ask you what effect you think what effect on UK-EU relations there will be from Britain joining the CPP arrangements in the Far East and the tilt to Asia? What effect do you think that will have?
Well, I think it's, the first, obviously if you leave the EU, the key thing is to take advantage of the new situation you're in. And we're not in the customs union, we're not in the single market, we're making this partnership work. And as part of that arrangement, we're free to make these trade arrangements with the rest of the world. And I'm delighted that we're doing CPTPP. We'll be one of the largest players in this new emerging bloc. We can help shape it and develop and grow it. And while, as the debate during my maiden speech showed, currently it's a small percentage of our trade. These are some of the fastest growing economies in the world. So I think we can do that consistent with our obligations under the withdrawal agreement, and we can make that work, and that's what we should be doing. There's no point leaving and not taking advantage of leaving, and that's what we're doing with things like that. I mean, obviously there's a sort of capacity issue about how many trade deals can we do, how quickly, but again, I've been impressed that actually there's a lot of very good work that's been done, and we need to keep that up.
Thank you very much.
Lord Honey.
Just following up, Foreign Secretary, if I could, the point about the structured framework that might be considered. I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that your successor as Prime Minister, in fact, included such an idea in the political declaration that was attached and which was then retained at the time that the Trade and Cooperation Agreement was agreed, but was then dropped. Doesn't that imply that both sides think that would be quite a useful thing to do? And don't you think that, for example, on China, and I'm not trying to lead the discussion onto a substantive discussion of China, it's going to be much trickier to have a full ability to talk through issues with China, particularly if they become really, really, really seriously difficult because of US-China relations with our European colleagues, if we don't have some structure of that kind which provides for it, because clearly you then have to create it, as it were, on the hoof. I just wonder what your feeling about that is.
Well, on the bigger point you're making about, should we be ad hoc or should we be structured? As I said, I'm practical, I'm results-based. I think the things I can see us doing on an ad hoc basis seem to be working very well. I mean, in a weird way, I liken it a bit under the coalition, where, when I was running a coalition government, the civil service advised, quite rightly, we must have a coalition committee. For whenever there's a problem, let's have a coalition committee, and all the panjandrums will gather, and we will use that to, iron out the difficulties and reach a conclusion. I think it met once. When we'd had a row that was so bad, we had to sort of get together in front of everybody to show that we were still committed to the coalition. But sometimes over-structuring something, the reason why it never met was we found very good ad hoc ways of getting things done. And so while I accept that, structures can sometimes help, we're really asking here, what's the best way of maximising the British interest and getting things done with our partners that we want to get done. And so, for instance, on China, there is a regular dialogue that we have with the EU. Part of our policy is to very much align with like-minded countries on China. I'm looking at this, but from what I can see, I think it partly goes to, who we are and what we're like. There's a brilliant industrialist put it to me the other day. We are big enough to matter, but small enough to be nimble. Now, if we're a much smaller country, it might be more important to insert yourself into one of these structured dialogues. But when the EU is looking for a partner, we've got the most capable military, we've got the biggest diplomatic network, we've got the second biggest aid budget. We've got huge capabilities, and so I don't think we're in a position of saying, please, can we join your China dialogue? We've got a very important relationship with China and huge historical knowledge and everything else, and so we're natural partners to talk to and have a conversation with. So I think it's a question of what works, and I think this is working well.
Lord Little.
I'm a member of this Parliamentary Partnership Assembly that's been set up between the EU and the UK, along with Lord Ricketts. And it's pretty evident to me that on the European Parliament side, there's a lot of support for a more formalised defence and security relationship as as time goes on. Particularly among the EPP, the Christian Democrats there. Why shouldn't Britain take advantage of that if there's, a warm feeling that it's desired? And I remember, I don't want to go back over the referendum campaign, but in the referendum campaign, one of the points you made as Prime Minister most forcefully and impressively was that being a member of the EU helped us maximise our influence on foreign policy and security. Have you changed your mind on that?
Look, if you're a member of the EU, you're in those structures and you try and make those structures, you try and bend them to your will as much as possible. Frustrating as that can sometimes be, because you want to issue a statement on Gaza and you're held up by Luxembourg and Malta. So, but you're in and you make the most of it. When you're out, it seems to me the most important thing is to ask yourself, right, how do we get done what we want to get done? How do we maximise our influence? So if you take things like, the Ukraine training mission, I would argue, we've we led that while we were still in the EU. We've supercharged our leadership of it outside the EU, and we're working with EU partners in our training program, and that's working very well. So in terms of, thank you for what you do. Obviously, the collaboration between parliamentarians, I think, is part of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, and so there are structures in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, and there are committees that meet to discuss all sorts of issues. Some of them are doing great work. I think they've had something like 42 meetings in the last period. But sometimes we're finding we're getting things done faster through these ad hoc mechanisms. I've mentioned sanctions with Ukraine. That one's working well. The economic and military support for Ukraine, that's working well. The training program for the military is working well. And so I think it's a question of finding what works. But I think it's a mistake to think, having left, that the best thing is to try and recreate the sort of structures you had when you were in. I don't think we should do that. We have to, we're in a new situation, out of the single market, out of the customs unit, with a trade and cooperation agreement, with all the equities and powers we have. How do we make the most of that? And how do we maximise the British interest, the British impact? And I think we need to think that's the question that we have to answer.
Thank you. Let's move on. We're going to come back to some of those Ukraine issues, Foreign Secretary, in just a moment. Lord Trenchard.
Thank you, Lord Chairman. Foreign Secretary, the European political community, which has just been mentioned, I think provides a platform for the UK to engage on an equal basis with EU member states. And it started very well. Although I think the third meeting in Spain, I'm not quite sure that it received as enthusiastic a response from all quarters. And I understand that the press conference planned for the end of that meeting was cancelled. And as a result of that, I understand there is as yet no date fixed for the next meeting of the political community, which you, Foreign Secretary, I imagine will host here in London. So how would you assess the value of the meetings so far? What will be the UK's priorities for the next meeting? And when do you think the date will be fixed?
Right. Well, first of all, I think it was a good idea. I think it was a President Macron initiative. And I think particularly timely with everything happening in Ukraine. And from what obviously I wasn't around at the time, but from what I've read, is that actually there were some very useful discussions on immigration and on energy, where us and European partners were able to use it for, quite strong but informal agreements in those areas. So I'm in favour of it continuing. I think it's a useful forum. We're committed to hosting a meeting, which we want to do. We're discussing with partners exactly when that should be, and we don't have a date set, but as soon as we do, we'll let you know. I think it's a good example of a sort of, and let's not make it, it's not too structured at the moment, it's quite informal, and I think that's right. Leader level, opportunity to discuss these issues. And I think actually immigration and energy are two kind of interesting areas where this whole question about structure, not structure, is interesting. When I had my first meeting with Maros Sefcovic in the Commission, obviously we want to, one of the simplest things we ought to be doing on energy is having a better free flow through our interconnectors at an effective price, because if we're overproducing wind power, that's cheaper energy for Europe. If the French nuclear stations are running longer and faster and the wind isn't blowing, that's cheaper energy for us. So getting that agreement, and of course, when you want that, maybe the first thing the Europeans will say, well, we better have a huge energy structured dialogue, and maybe we have to have that. But actually, what I'm interested in is getting the early win for British consumers and for British energy providers. There's a danger sometimes of putting something into a structure that every single European country has to be consulted, everyone has to take part. You get absolutely surrounded by bureaucracy and nothing gets done. So there are dangers with the over-structuralisation, if that's a word.
Yes, thank you very much. And could I follow on from Lord Liddell's question that about structure versus non-structure, that we have recently announced, in fact, I think that the Defence Secretary signed this morning in Tokyo a treaty establishing the trilateral Global Combat Air Programme, the GCAP, aircraft, together with Italy and with Japan, which has not needed any EU defence structures to be realised, or at least to get to the kick-off point, involving Italy, a full EU member, presumably subject to EU defence, the rules of EU defence structures, and Japan, never an EU member, and the UK, a former EU member. So I think that's very interesting. But I'd also like to ask you if you think there will be other such agreements. But Lord Lamont talked about our tilt to Indo-Pacific. And surely the EU will also want to tilt to Indo-Pacific, because the CPTPP countries are growing twice as fast as the EU countries, and more than half of the global growth predicted over the next 10 years is going to be in Asia-Pacific. Won't they want to do the same?
I'm sure they will, but I think it comes back to my big enough to matter, small enough to be nimble thing. So our tilt to the Indo-Pacific isn't just a phrase. I mean, you can see with the AUKUS agreement, classic example of big, they want to include us because of our capabilities and submarine capabilities. That's a big move, and I think important. Having the new status at ASEAN is one of the few countries to do that. The Hiroshima Accords with Japan. I mean, right now it's extraordinary to think something would be unthinkable in my parents' or grandparents' day of, British forces with Japanese forces training in Japan and doing live exercises. So these are things that the Indo-Pacific tilt consists of, and obviously CPTPP is the most significant of them. But it's a proper, thought-through policy with a number of things, actually real things that are happening, which I'm sure if the EU wants to find its own way of doing those things, it can. But we're of a size and a scale where we're capable of making these steps ourselves and making a success of them.
Foreign Secretary, before we come to Ukraine, where we've got a number of questions, I just wanted to ask you about our bilateral relationships with two of the major European countries. It's 13 years since Lancaster House, the UK-French treaties, and I'd be interested to know how you see the prospects for further UK-French foreign policy defence cooperation. There was a summit on the 10th of March with Prime Minister and President Macron, which had a long laundry list of things. But I wonder how you see the state of that relationship. And in particular, do you think there's the same scope to have a strategic relationship with Germany in the new state of European security? Something doesn't have to be exactly the same as the French, but a more strategic, long-term security defence relationship with Germany as well.
Well, I'm very proud of the Lancaster House Agreement. I had a very wise national security advisor at the time. I can't think who it was, but who was advising me about it. But it's always struck me that the UK and France have militaries of similar scale and ambition. We're both nuclear powers, both military and civil. We're both permanent members of the UN Security Council. We both have interests around the world. We both have, relations with former colonies that either through the Commonwealth or the Francophonie, which are important to us. And so this idea of trying to come together and build this stronger alliance and cooperate in all sorts of defence areas, but also in the most sensitive nuclear areas, was a great ambition, and I was glad it was realised, and I think it's been a success, more successful in some areas than others, but nonetheless a success. And I think there's a real opportunity next year to take it a step further if we can sort out a really high-level and powerful Anglo-French summit, which I'm sure we can, and I think there's great enthusiasm on the French side as there is on the British side. So I think all to the good. And my ambition would be to try and do more. I think, we've both got the same challenges of we're living in a more dangerous and uncertain world. We've got extraordinary military capabilities, but extraordinary costs of maintaining them, and there are things that we can do and we can share. I think the German partnership, we do have a very high level of strategic dialogue and partnership with Germany. I don't think it's quite the same because they're not a nuclear power in the same way. The military ambition and reach is different. So I don't think it will work in quite the same way. I think there are other things we can do with the Germans. Indeed, I was talking to my German opposite number this morning about the situation in Israel and Gaza, and I think we're very like-minded on all the things we want to do and all the things we want to see change there. But I don't think a sort of Lancaster House partnership would be appropriate.
Right, thank you. In terms of France, it's the 120th anniversary of the Entente Cordiale next year, which is a very good peg for another push forward on UK-French relations. Sorry, I'll stop the advertisement. Baroness Blackstone.
Good afternoon, Foreign Secretary. Following up on the Chair's questions about bilateral relations, particularly with France, it's a more specific area, but it's a very topical one. You just mentioned it in terms of your discussion with the German Foreign Minister. Have you had any discussions with President Macron or his Foreign Minister on the whole issue of Israel-Gaza, where he has taken a rather different position to that of the UK government, in particular in requesting an immediate ceasefire around 10 days ago? Something that
I have, yes. I haven't had a conversation with President Macron. I have with his foreign minister, who I've already had several meetings with. And maybe it's worth giving a sort of proper answer to this question. Our position is, I don't want this conflict to last a moment longer than is necessary. But if we're going to have a ceasefire, it needs to be a sustainable ceasefire, a ceasefire in which Hamas is no longer in pauses. We would welcome another early humanitarian pause, urgent humanitarian pause, to get aid in and get hostages out. And we want to see this conflict end as soon as possible. But we want that to happen with a sustainable ceasefire. And I think the problem with the UN resolution that came before the Security Council and then the General Assembly, and that is why we abstained on it rather than voted in favour of it, is I think it was asking for this approach which says, immediate ceasefire, but two-state solution, as it were. That's what people want. And those two things, they don't go together. If you have an immediate ceasefire, but Hamas still armed to the teeth, launching rockets into Israel, wanting to repeat October the 7th, you'll never have a two-state solution. And I know the British are sort of can be annoyingly sort of logical and factual and down-to-earth about it. But, I totally understand countries that just sign up for the immediate ceasefire, say they want a two-state solution and don't reconcile those things. But I think we should try and reconcile those things. So yes to urgent pauses, yes to aid in and hostages out, yes to sustainable ceasefire, and yes to two-state solution. But I don't think we should vote for things that are inconsistent with those views. And so that's the difference between us and what the French voted for and others voted for. The Germans, I think, with us, abstained when the vote went to the General Assembly. But I think our approach is the right one.
But can I just ask one more question?
Yeah.
Have you really any hope of getting in the medium term to a two-state solution and working with our European partners on such a development in a context where in the West Bank a huge amount of what was Palestinian land has now been occupied by illegal settlements? How are we going to make...
I think getting to the two-state solution is extremely difficult, and it's been made, in many ways more difficult by what happened on October the 7th, because obviously ordinary Israelis think, how can we ever have a two-state solution if part of the state or the state is run by these people? So in the short term, it feels more difficult, but we must, I think, try to use the horrific nature of what's happened to think of the long term and how you have a genuine peace and stability for Israel, which involves peace and stability and justice for Palestinian people having a state of their own. Is it technically, is it now sort of physically impossible? No, I don't think it is. I was in Israel recently, and every time I go, I always ask for the same tour by the same person, the charming Danny Seidman, who walks you around East Jerusalem and shows you the latest state of settlements and says, yes, it's getting worse, but it is still possible to bring about a two-state solution if we act with purpose. And so I think it is still possible, but the pathway from where we are today to getting there is very, very difficult. But you've got to start with a sustainable ceasefire, i.e. Hamas not capable of doing what they did. You've then got to think about what comes afterwards in terms of how do you bring stability, security and services to Gaza. You've got to think of how you reform the Palestinian Authority and revitalize it, because ultimately, while many people point out its weaknesses, it's still a body that represents many Palestinians and actually has capabilities in Gaza as well. And then you've got to start thinking, what are the principles and actions that would get you towards a two-state solution? And it's hard to do that if all you've got is a set of principles. You're not really going to get buy-in from the Arab states and others that want to see these things happen. If you have a fully announced plan on day one, the thing will probably fall over and collapse and you won't get anywhere. So it's how do you go between those two poles to create something where people can see that there's real momentum and progress towards a long-term solution. But is it impossible? No, but it's going to be very hard in the months ahead.
Lord Hannay, just briefly,
Very
perhaps,
short
we'll
one
go to
on that,
Ukraine.
because I noted that the Israeli ambassador this morning said flatly that a two-state solution was completely ruled out for her government. Do we think that she was speaking on instructions, or and what are we going to do about that?
I don't know, is the answer. I read the transcript and it is disappointing. But ultimately, if true security and stability for Israel, which is something I care deeply about, I believe in Israel as a homeland for Jewish people, I believe in its right to exist, to thrive, to defend itself, and all the rest of it. Long-term security, I think, requires there to be a state for Palestine as well. I don't think we should put too much weight on one interview. We have to get on and think about how to help make this happen.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's move on to what you've called, Foreign Secretary, the defining challenge of this generation, which is Ukraine. Lord Jay.
Thank you very much. Welcome, Foreign Secretary. I'd like to ask a question about the war in Ukraine. And you went to Ukraine early on in your time as Foreign Secretary, which I think many of us were extremely pleased to see. Last month, Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief said that, and I quote, "As in the First World War, we've reached a level of technology that puts us into a stalemate." And that was a pretty chilling thing to say. I just wondered what you thought we, the United Kingdom, could do to help Ukraine out of that stalemate, and whether you thought we could succeed.
I think there are two things in the sort of short to medium term. One is, while there is something of a stalemate on land, there certainly isn't a stalemate on the Black Sea, where in the last few months, the Ukrainians have effectively pushed the Russian Navy right out of Crimea and Sevastopol back across the Black Sea, and in the process sunk a significant proportion of the Russian Black Sea fleet. And that's important, A, because it shows how badly this war is going from Putin's point of view, and remember, he's lost something like 300,000 troops. And B, it opens up the shipping lane for Ukrainian ships, and I think something like 280 ships have already used the new safe lane. It's not the grain initiative, it's not some UN thing, it is force of arms that's brought this about. And that means that Ukraine is exporting again, the economy is growing again, which leads to the second point, which is, we've got to show that we are in this for as long as it takes, with whatever it takes to help the Ukrainians. And that is obviously military support and the diplomatic support, but it's also this economic support, not just finance, but helping them to grow their economy, because that helps them to sustain what they're doing. So I think those two things, the naval picture and the economic support and getting the economy growing, combined with the recovery conference that we hosted here in London in June, I think those are all crucial. But obviously we're meeting at a time where the EU is thinking about its package, the US is thinking about its package, and you know, the best Christmas present we could give to the Ukrainians is to pass both those packages. And if we don't, we're giving a Christmas present to Vladimir Putin, and we shouldn't be doing that.
Well, I was going to ask about that last point. I mean, how united do you think we and the rest of the EU are, and how? I mean, Zelensky clearly had quite a difficult meeting in Washington this week. I mean, how united, if you were sitting in Ukraine, would the West seem?
Well, but first of all, sitting in Ukraine, okay, I was only there for a few days, but you do get this incredible sense of national unity about what they are doing. And there's no sense that the war will be lost because of any lack of enthusiasm in Ukraine. I mean, people say that, you know, Zelensky's approval ratings have slipped to 80%. I mean, I used to dream of approval ratings of 30%, let alone 80%. So, I mean, I think there's extraordinary unity in Ukraine for what they're doing. I think if you stand back and look at the big picture of what's happened compared with what Putin thought would happen, you know, you've had not only 300,000 Russian casualties, you've had this expansion of NATO, you've had Finland and Sweden coming in, you've had, you know, NATO meetings where you've never seen such unity and enthusiasm and commitment. And you've also seen a very united EU, which is not what we saw in 2014, to be frank. Now, moving to America, it's frustrating because there is a majority in Congress to give money to, and a lot of money to Ukraine and a lot of weapons. And that's a combination of Democrats and Republicans. It's just frustrating that the politics at the moment are locking this together with support for Israel, support for the southern border, and a sort of political dispute, which I'll try to stay out of. But it can be fixed, and I think it will be fixed. I'm just not sure it'll be fixed in time for Christmas, which is frustrating. It is true to say that, you know, in domestic US politics, there are people saying, is this really our priority? Shouldn't we be doing other things? And I think, you know, we have to be frank as politicians that we have to fix our domestic political problems, whether it's immigration problems or lack of economic progress problems. We've got to fix, if we fix those things, we don't only become domestically stronger, we become more capable internationally. And so we shouldn't shy away from that debate. But fundamentally, will the EU put forward its money? I think it will. I hope the outcome will be good from the EU Council. Will the US put forward its money? Yes, I think it will. Will the UK? Yes, we'll be doing this next year. And I think that those three things combined will be very material.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Ernest Nicholson wanted to follow up.
Chair, does the Foreign Secretary feel that, given that Russia is rebuilding her economy on a war footing, does he feel that we and the EU are taking that seriously enough, particularly with the defence space for munitions, to allow Ukraine to hold what she has and to properly deter in the Baltic, in that inaction will have a consequence this time?
I think it's a very good question, and it's certainly, I think I mentioned in the House the other day that it's one of the things that, while I think we've done brilliant things in supporting Ukraine, it's the one area where I think we need to do more. What we've done is we have obviously supplied the Ukrainian armed forces with a lot of sort of Soviet-style and era equipment that fits with what they have, and that's been very useful. We've given a lot of very capable equipment we have, and I think we should be proud that we were often the first to do it. You know, first with the anti-tank weapons, first with the long-range artillery, first with the tanks, first with the long-range Storm Shadow missiles. But I think you're right, there's a danger of running down supplies and not doing enough to fire up the engines of the defence industries. And there's a number of steps we're looking at about what more we can do in that area. It's obviously a sort of cross-government initiative. It requires defence and business. And I think also what we do, we could try and replicate with European allies and partners. And I'm very focused on that. I think there's more we can do. Yes, the Russians are doing it. It's interesting. Their defence spending is now back to the level it was just before the Soviet Union collapsed. So there are costs sometimes from doing these things, but we certainly need to do more. Part of that will require, I think, multi-year funding, because obviously you need to be able to say to the defence industries, this is an ongoing commitment. It's worth building these new production lines. It's worth building this new capacity because it's going to be needed. And I think it's a good moment to do that because as A, we can help Ukraine, but B, as the chairman said, we're living in a much more dangerous world. It's clear we need to spend on defence at a high level, and we need to make sure we have stockpiles and equipment that match this more dangerous world rather than the slightly more benign circumstances we've faced in the past.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. On sanctions, Baroness Scott.
Yes, thank you. In your response to Lord Liddell, you talked about sanctions as an area where there isn't a sort of a structure really for cooperation. So I wonder if you could describe for us how the high-level discussions take place with the EU on formulation of sanctions policy, and also where you stand on the question of whether we ought to be in lockstep with the EU on sanctions policy, or whether it doesn't matter, or indeed there are advantages on going our own way.
Okay, well, thank you. I mean, the answer is there's a sanctions coordinators forum, which is G7 and EU member states, and that meets quarterly, which keeps us all focused on who we're sanctioning, how we're doing it, and the rest. So it's a good piece of. I mean, when I say ad hoc, sort of sounds like it's just people. There's a structure, but it's a set up for an ad hoc purpose, and it's working. As far as I can see, it's working very well. The way we sanction people is a bit different sometimes. I mean, one example would be in the EU, transport sanctions matter a lot because, lorries move from mainland Europe into Russia. So those are very important. They get, obviously with us, the scale and size of the financial services, City of London, so financial sanctions need to be carried out quickly and effectively. But I think from what I've seen, the coordination has been very good through this group, including the US. And so I think it's working quite well. So even if it's not absolutely lockstep, it's been pretty much lockstep.
And the effectiveness of the sanctions I don't mean how effective are sanctions per se, although I know perhaps some colleagues may want to ask about that, but in your own terms, is the effectiveness hampered at all by the fact that enforcement is a member state competence in Europe, and are there any issues around that?
Well, the effectiveness, as I'm told, is that without sanctions, we estimate Russia would have had over $400 billion more to fund the war. So we think that sanctions, if you take them all together, have been effective. In terms of policing them, one issue is obviously where you've got sort of leakages, and we are working very hard to try and spot those. In fact, it was last week we sanctioned, I think, 46 different entities in 11 different countries, including 3 in China. And that was all about the sale of dual-use goods. Uzbekistan, actually, there was a NATO member, Turkey, that had some companies that was, we think, involved in this. So we're certainly on the case of trying to make sure that all the sanctions, whether personal or trade, are as effective as possible. In terms of, in the EU, I think that's a matter for them. We're outside the EU. We make sure our sanctions are put in place effectively. We've got this new sanctions regime where it's a sort of FCDO policy, but of course if it's a financial sanction, it's done by the Treasury. If it's a trade sanction, it's done by the Trade Department. And that seems to be working well. But it's up for them if they want to make it a community competence or a national competence. I don't have to get involved in those things anymore. What a relief.
Well, sorry, just very quickly on that. I mean, if it becomes obvious that there's a particular country that is not cooperating in that sense, and you're seeing some leakage, are you saying that you wouldn't have any bilateral discussions with?
Oh, of course we would. Yes, no, absolutely. And by the way, if we thought that an EU country, if we thought companies in an EU country were selling goods to Russia, we would sanction them. That's it was regrettable doing it to a company based in Turkey because they're a NATO ally, but we've got to do everything we can to stop Russia's war machine getting dual-use goods. End of.
Lord Lamont.
The EU High Representative for External Affairs was quoted in yesterday's paper as saying that the EU was considering sanctions or travel restrictions on settlers on the West Bank. Is that something that would come before the coordination forum? Is it something we would consider if action was taken by the EU?
I don't think it would, because really the sanctions forum has been more about what's happening in Ukraine and sanctions on Russia and Belarus. On this issue of sanctions against settler violence, I mean, it's something that America has taken action on. We announced yesterday that we are taking action on travel bans on people who've committed these acts of extremism and violence. And obviously we try and, coordinate that with, I've discussed that with other European partners already. And obviously there's another level we can go to if you want to add to a travel ban a further sanction. That would be, asset freezes along with travel bans. That is an option too, but we've taken the travel ban action first. So I think I might be wrong about that. I think that actually the sanctions group can consider sanctions in every circumstance and country, but on this occasion, we saw what I spoke to the Americans, could see what they were planning, and we decided to take action. It will be discussed at the sanctions coordination group, but we haven't waited for it. We've got on and done it, are doing it, because it is being put in place by the Home Office.
Thank you. Just one more question on sanctions. Is it a problem that the Russians are now able to sell their oil at above $60 a barrel to countries like India?
Obviously, we want to do everything we can to make sure this cap is effective, and I think it's, it has been an effective move. It's definitely starved Russia of money, but we need to keep up the pressure of trying to make sure that whenever they're using shadow fleets or what have you, we go after the shadow fleet, go after the money, go after the providers. But it's you can see they're trying everything because it's hurting. But we have to be as effective at finding them as they are at finding ways around it.
Thank you very much. Baroness Blackstone.
As of course you know, our current inquiry is looking at the effect of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia on UK-EU relations. Yeah. One of the issues that is emerging as a theme that we probably need to cooperate with you on is the whole area of reconstruction. If we're going to be involved in reconstruction, it's also extremely important, is it not, that the whole issue of corruption, which has been a serious one in Ukraine, is tackled. I wonder if you could tell the committee a bit about how you perceive our potential work with the EU on this area of reconstruction. I know there's some has already started, but where it's going to go next, and more specifically, what we need to do about corruption.
Well, first of all, on corruption, we work directly with the Ukrainians, as we have for many years, trying to help them with specific anti-corruption measures. I think actually their anti-corruption court and their anti-corruption office were based on support and ideas coming from the UK, and I think they've been effective. I think, of course, there's a problem and much more needs to be done, but I think sometimes we should remember that they've already introduced legislation so that members of parliament in Ukraine, public servants in Ukraine, I think they make a lifelong declaration of their assets and income and what have you. So, there's a lot of progress is being made. On the issue of reconstruction, again, I'm afraid it's another set of initials for you. The Multi-Agency Donor Coordination Platform, that is a EU G7 setup, which has been, I think, very effective set of arrangements that we sit in to provide the financial support and other supports for Ukraine. And we are working with Ukraine and the EU on a Ukraine plan for reconstruction. So again, I think we're plugged in at all the right levels. And one of the discussions we had this week in Cabinet was about making sure that the UK partnership with Ukraine is as broad as possible. It shouldn't just include the economic and diplomatic support. I mean, the cultural links that are growing between our countries, the fact that so many people, myself included, have hosted Ukrainian families in their home, I think this is a huge opportunity for us to grow much closer to a major European country, which I have no doubt that will one day be an enormous success story. I mean, it's as per capita GDP is about a third of that of Poland. I don't see any reason why over time it can't achieve those levels. So I think there's going to be, longer term, this is an important relationship with the UK. We're determined to make the most of it. And in terms of reconstruction, we're very joined up with partners.
Do you think that the Europeans need to discuss this issue quite urgently with the US, given there's now quite a lot of discussion about Ukraine being Europe's problem, not one for the US? I mean, that's mainly been about military support and additional armament.
Yeah.
But there's a medium-term issue on...
I mean, I think from what I've seen, I mean, A, the Americans are absolutely in the multi-agency donor coordination platform, and B, Secretary Blinken leads a lot of the G7 work. So we recently had a G7 call on how specifically to help Ukraine's energy infrastructure, not least as it's coming into this winter. What can we do to harden the energy? What can we do to provide backup generators? So I see the Americans as they're extremely positive players in this. He was the person who brought this together and coordinated it. And so, yes, they need to be involved. Yes, they are involved. I think that clearly in the American debate, we need to insert ourselves and say, look, you were quite right in the past to say Europe wasn't doing enough on its defence. I think when I announced in Cardiff at the NATO conference we should all do 2%, I think there were 5 of us. There are now, will be by the end of this year, perhaps as many as 21 NATO players over 2%. And I think we need to insert ourselves into the US debate and say, yes, I know you want us to do more, but actually on Ukraine, if you add up military and civilian, Europe, EU plus UK, is actually now doing almost twice as much as America. So we really are pulling our weight. So when they say, this is your neighbourhood, this is your problem, yes, and that's why we're leaning in as much as we are, but then also make the point to them, as I did in Washington last week, European security really matters to the US. History tells us that if you allow people to redraw borders by force, eventually the US gets drawn in and it'll cost more money and it'll be American lives on the line as well as just cash. Because Putin isn't stopped, who knows, the next country he invade might well be a NATO one. So I think that argument, I don't know, one mustn't overestimate one's own arguments, but I think it does land in America. And we have to get into that debate because otherwise the isolationist tendency will run away with things. I found the other argument that works when you say to Americans, look, you've spent effectively 10% of your defense budget, but with that, combined with the bravery of the Ukrainian armed forces, they have destroyed 50% of Russia's pre-war military strength. And if someone had come along and offered you that, you probably would have said, that sounds like a great deal.
I just ask one more thing. You haven't mentioned the multilateral agencies and their potential role in reconstruction. So that obviously includes the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development.
Yes, and the World Bank, all of those. And of course the IMF plays a crucial role, and we need to back up the IMF with the guarantees and loans and other economic support we're giving. All of these things, I mean, it need to be marshalled to help Ukraine and to demonstrate there's this, massive long-term goodwill and support that's going to carry on through this period. Because at the moment Putin thinks he can outlast the West. And we need to, it's a simple fact, if you add up the countries on our side, we outmatch Russia's GDP by about 25-1. We've just got to make that economic difference count. And that's the challenge.
Okay. Thank you. Baroness Ainley. Sorry, Lord Little, did you want to comment on this one point?
I just wondered,
briefly.
I know what the answer is going to be to the question, but just put my own personal feelings is that we're not doing enough. Is that we said we were going to increase defence spending to 2.5. There's no sign of any movement on that score in the latest budget. The Public Accounts Committee said that the that the money set aside for re-equipping the army on ammunition because of what's been sent to Ukraine is actually being used by the Ministry of Defence for other purposes. We're cutting the size of the army. Is this really the right response, given this is an existential crisis for democracy in Europe?
We are above 2%. I mean, the figures vary because economic forecasts vary, but we are above 2%. And I think actually, the key question is, are we spending the money in the right places? Are we buying the new capabilities? And obviously the government I led did quite a lot on that front, getting into the whole I-STAR and drone technology, re-equipping the Navy, making our armed forces more mobile with new transport planes and the whole new fleet of Chinooks and all the rest of it. But I think one of the things we've seen, not just in this conflict, but actually in some of the earlier conflicts in previous years, is this massive change in technology in terms of drones, often quite inexpensive drones, that are completely changing the state of the battlefield. So, of course, we need to think about how much we spend on defence in a dangerous world, and we're above 2% and potentially rising. But we also need to think, are we actually, taking the proper long-term decisions to give us the equipment that we need at the right price? And I think that's an ongoing discussion.
Baroness Ainley.
Good afternoon, Foreign Secretary. And I'd like to follow up on a previous question there about the issue of reconstruction of Ukraine. Now, the committee during the period of this inquiry has heard about proposals for using the sanctioned assets of those that have contributed to assistance to Russia, but using that as a way of contributing to funding the reconstruction of Ukraine. So could you please outline to us the UK government's current view of the feasibility of actually using sanctioned access and assets, and also against the background of the announcement just last month by the President of the European Commission that the EU is already working on a proposal to focus on the so-called windfall profits that Russia's made from the central bank assets?
Yes. Just dealing with that last point, the money that's in Euroclear is sort of cash that's earning interest, and so it's quite easy to spend that money, whereas the sanctioned assets that could be yachts or houses or whatever, obviously are not necessarily interest-bearing in the same way. So there's a slight difference. But to answer the bigger question, is it time not just to freeze the assets, not just to spend some of the interest, but is it time to spend some of the assets or not? My view is that there is a legal route to doing this, first of all, and that when we look at the issues, I think there's some very strong answers for why we should consider doing this. Some of the arguments against are, does this have a chilling effect on other investment into the UK? Well, if people are chilled, I would have thought they'd be pretty chilled by the fact we've frozen them. So I think the other set of arguments about the difficulties, the precedents, all the rest of it, I think a lot of those fall into the category of it's time to realise that the world has changed. And that we are in a more difficult and dangerous and disputatious world. We're in a world where Russia has launched a European war. We're in, a real fight for the sort of security on our continent that we believe in. And extraordinary times require extraordinary measures. So I'm instinctively in favour of trying to do this. Where we've got to is we're working very hard with the G7 about whether we can find a common approach. And I think that would be great because while we've got some sanctioned assets, actually there's far more in other G7 countries and other EU countries, not least the Euroclear figures you spoke about. But I wouldn't rule out if we couldn't achieve a common G7 approach. I think the Americans are quite forward-leaning on this. Maybe there's something we could do with the Americans. Anyway, I'm for pushing hard on this. I think the world's changed. I think the arguments against aren't as strong as people said, and I think there is a legal route. And if you've got those three things, I'll be in favour of moving forward.
And Foreign Secretary just stated something I wouldn't disagree with, and that is that extraordinary times mean you have extraordinary methods. I wonder, therefore, can I go from the general to the particular and further ask questions further to those I put to Minister Doherty on Tuesday about the delay of more than 18 months in securing the donation of Mr. Roman Abramovich's 2.3 billion proceeds from selling his football club. Now, at this stage, it seems as though the UK government is dragging its feet. That's not something I normally associate with your activity, Foreign Secretary. So how is the government going to ensure that Mr. Abramovich is not going to slither away from fulfilling his promises?
Right. Well, I'm very keen that we don't allow that. I think it was the right move to take, and it's good that it's happened. I mean, we are very keen that that money is spent on humanitarian causes in Ukraine, not on other causes linked to Ukraine or anything else. And so there is an issue with that, which we need to see through. It may take a bit of time, but I think it's important to get the right result. But you're right to pressure us on this. I'm on it.
Thank you, Foreign Secretary. You've repeated the view of the previous Foreign Secretary that sometimes you take time and don't act quickly. It's just that clearly, as far as Ukraine is concerned, time can run out.
I agree. I'm glad I've stuck to collective responsibility. I'm trying to do that, but I'm apprised of the fact. I think it's just this disagreement about how to go forward, and I don't want us to, give way unless we can get the right result.
Lord Honey.
Yes, Foreign Secretary, if we could switch to Ukraine's candidacy for EU membership now. Recognising, which of course we all do, that the accession of Ukraine is a matter for the EU and its member states alone, does the government consider that an EU which had Ukraine as a member would be in the strategic interests of the UK? And would you favour also, and this is a bit of a separate part of the question, would you favour close coordination both with our NATO partners and the EU partners over their respective enlargement processes?
Yes, the way I look at this is, we are strong supporters of Ukraine. We're strong supporters of Ukraine wanting to anchor itself in the Euro-Atlantic alliance. We're not members of the EU, so we don't have a role in that debate. But we note what Ukraine wants, and we want for Ukraine to succeed in its aims and goals. Now, we are a member of NATO, and we're doing everything we can to help Ukraine in its ambitions to join NATO. And that's not just about how you vote on the kind of, do you get an invitation or not? It's actually, can we help you configure your armed forces in a way that makes them more interoperable? Can we help you reform your defence practices and equipment that makes it more likely that you can join? Can we find ways of structuring coordination with you in different NATO projects so that you become even more likely to join? So where we're in an organisation and can help them join, we're absolutely all in and doing what we can. In terms of Europe, it's a matter for the EU. It's a matter for them to decide. But and as I say, we support Ukraine in its ambitions. But I can't affect the discussion that's happening on that. And so I think our role is to help Ukraine in all the ways we can to anchor it in that Euro-Atlantic alliance.
Yes, I think that's very helpful, what you say. And of course, the committee recognises very well that you are quite right. We have no say on them joining the EU. But the question really was, and I interpret your response as being pretty positive, that it would be in Britain's interest that their application to join should succeed.
Well, we want them to, if you think about Ukraine, they're fighting this war. We want them to be successful in that. They're growing their economy. We want them to be successful in that. They've applied to join NATO and the EU to anchor themselves in the Euro-Atlantic Alliance. We want them to succeed. But, you know, I'm conscious of that. If you're not in charge of saying yes or no to something, you've got to work with Ukraine to help them in whatever way you can. Who knows what, you know, the Hungarian Prime Minister will or won't do this Thursday. And I used to know him quite well. I think he's changed a bit maybe since then. But, you know, we're not in control of that. But what we can do is help this country in every way we can to succeed. And, you know, there are, as I think we're demonstrating, you can have a partnership and make that work.
Thank you.
Lord Liddell.
This is a different focus, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, and the clause in it which calls for a review of it, I think starting next year, or certainly the initials work on it starting next year. Interested in what your view of this is. Obviously, it's a big strategic thing in our relations with the European Union. Would you want it to be extensive, or do you think it's likely to be relatively insignificant? I mean, you said right at the, you know, that you'd kept out of the whole debate about the TCA after you ceased to be Prime Minister, and I understand the reasons for that. But I think a lot of us now who are on the Remain side of the argument feel that we might, with more cooperative politics, have got a better outcome in terms of the TCA than we actually got. And the question is, do you think there's any willingness on the part of the European Union to look at these issues again? Or do you, what do you think is going to happen?
Look, we have effectively a free trade agreement. It's one of the biggest free trade agreements in the world in terms of, no tariffs, no quotas. And, you know, our aim is to maximise that, to make the most of that. As I said right at the beginning, I think if you take the last year, a year in which, you know, we've had a Prime Minister who's built, I think, extremely good relations with individual EU countries and also with the institutions and with Ursula von der Leyen at the Commission. I think you've seen real results. You've seen an agreement over financial services. You've seen Britain getting a good deal on joining the Horizon programme, as we're a research and science superpower. You've seen the Windsor framework, which I hope will help with the situation in Northern Ireland. So let's make the most of what we've got, I think is the way I would approach it. I don't think trying to sort of reopen it and change the nature of it is what we should be doing. There's plenty of things to discuss that are there. I think the other thing, and this is not trying to be evasive, that we're now a friend, neighbour and partner, and when we have these reviews, we obviously got some things we'd like to fix, but they've already got some things they want to fix with us. And it doesn't always help laying out a huge list of things in advance. So I want us to, you know, be canny and tough operators to get the best out of this.
Okay. Lord Lamont and then Lord Hannay.
But isn't the review clause narrowly drawn and actually is restricted to how the actual free trade agreement has operated, how the TCA has operated? Isn't it, in fact, the reality that as long as you are not in the single market or not in the customs union, you can't really make huge changes to the trading arrangements?
Well, it says, Article 776 of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement says, the parties shall jointly review the implementation of this agreement and supplementing agreements and any matters related thereto 5 years after its entry into force, and then every 5 years. So yes, you're absolutely correct in what you say, but I think that still provides quite a lot of maximisation, as it were, and issues arising. And I absolutely agree. You know, we have a massive free trade agreement. That's what we've got. That's what we're going to make the most of. And there'll be plenty of things to discuss under that. But it's not about reopening, you know, we're not suddenly going to reopen free movement or go back into the customs union or any of those things. That is absolutely not what this is about.
Lord Hanley.
Well, exactly. Looking at the downside of this, I'm sure you're aware, but perhaps you can confirm this, that there are risks in the government's policy on Rwanda, the bill that is before the House of Commons at the moment, which will come to us in due course, which, if it were to lead to some impediment to the European Convention on Human Rights, would put at risk the TCA because of the terms which it is written into the TCA. You are conscious of that, are you? And you are aware that there is a downside in this that could come into play if the form of the legislation takes a particular shape.
Yes, I mean, look, I started off by reading the judgment of the Supreme Court, and when you read that, it's really, it's not really about ECHR, it's about the dangers of refoulement of refugees from Rwanda back to the countries they've come from. And so what the government's done, which I fully support, is a bill that is extremely tough, but within our international obligations, but crucially a treaty with Rwanda, which most people thought wouldn't be possible, but was achieved by my predecessor as Foreign Secretary, now Home Secretary, in super quick time, and it's a very rock-solid treaty about which it covers this issue of refoulement, and then an evidence pack of what things are really like in Rwanda for people who live there. And people often forget that, you know, Rwanda hosts Afghan schools that relocated from Afghanistan to Rwanda, schools from Sudan that relocated to Rwanda. It has, you know, it gets this sort of pasting sometimes in the parts of the press, but actually which I think it doesn't deserve. So I'm confident that we've got the right approach, that we can get this policy to work. And it's crucial that we do because we're, you know, going back a bit in the conversation, it's highly visible illegal migration is upending the politics and people's faith in politics and politicians and systems, not just in Britain, but all over the world. I mean, when you're in America, every other news item is about the problems on the southern border and the 6 million people that have crossed that border over the last 5 or 6 years. Every European conversation you have, compared with when I was Prime Minister 7 years ago, every European conversation is about what are we going to do about the problems of illegal migration. We've got to, now of course there are enormous downstream answers which the FCDO, my department, has a lot to do with. How do we help stabilise fragile states? How do we invest in economies that create jobs for people so they don't want to travel? There's lots of good stuff to be done there, but you've got to have a method of dealing with illegal migration, which is what the Rwanda bill is all about.
Yes, the question did still relate to the mechanisms that we use to implement that and the risk that they will bring us into conflict with our obligations.
I don't think it.
I merely asked, and I don't want to press this further.
No, but I don't think it raises that risk.
Thank you. Ernest Blackstone, and then we'll.
Very quick question. Do you think the very high costs of this scheme per applicant to remain in the UK who's sent instead to Rwanda are justified?
I think we have to answer this question. I mean, obviously, the best thing would be if we could pick up someone who arrives on a beach in Kent and take them straight back to France. But we can't do that. I remember when we were dealing with the migration crisis and people were crossing from Turkey to Greece, and it went on and on and on, and the numbers grew and grew and grew. And then we had that deal, which was highly criticised at the time, which gave Turkey quite a lot of money. They were looking after a lot of refugees from Syria. But crucially, every person who arrived on a boat in Greece or a Greek island from Turkey went straight back again. And the deal at that stage, from memory, was that every time that happened, the EU would take someone else from Turkey. But of course what happened is the trade collapsed. The numbers went absolutely through the floor, because as soon as you take away the people smuggling model, because people are paying a people smuggler to take them from A to B, as soon as you go from B straight back to A, there's no point paying the people smuggler. So while I accept it's expensive, it answers the question. And if you can't provide the answer, you're going straight back to France, which we can't do. The French won't have it and the EU won't allow it. This is an answer to the question, and that's why I support it.
Thank you. We've got three other areas just to cover fairly briefly. The first is youth mobility. Baroness Nicholson.
Might the Foreign Secretary wish to update this committee on the question of youth mobility? I know there are various agreements with individual member states. Might there be a possibility of accepting what this committee earlier proposed, of a full EU agreement on youth mobility? I say because the agony that has been caused for the creative industries, the musicians, in only having individual agreements has been very difficult indeed. And of course it's much easier and cheaper for everyone if we can have some collective agreement on youth mobility.
Well, what we've done is, you know, because I know you've been looking at this, is we have been having bilateral discussions about this issue, including with the French, about mobility, for instance, for school visits. And I think actually going to your point about the musicians, I think there are only now 4 countries in Europe that don't accept a sort of non-visa route. And so we have, you know, I'm sure we'll deal with the remaining 4. So we have, you know, gone a long way to dealing with that problem. I think with the schools thing, I would prefer us to keep going with these bilateral discussions. I think that the problem of going further is, you know, I think we'll get straight into, well, why don't we have a youth mobility scheme that's, you know, complete mobility for everyone up to the age of X, and you're straight back into free movement of people. And so I just don't think that's the right way to go. I think let's try and deal with this problem, school trips and school visits, and build it from there, rather than try and do it another way.
Continuing just a moment on the touring artists, which has been an issue that has come up a lot at the Parliamentary Partnership Assembly, and strong support there. The fact that they are still facing multiple different bilateral regimes makes it very difficult, particularly for young and emerging talents who haven't got the back office support in order to meet all these different requirements around Europe. Would you be prepared to consider the idea of some sort of visa waiver agreement, EU-wide, and also for EU artists coming to the UK, because that would be the way to deal with it and free up a sector which is very important to many people but is very blocked at the moment?
I do, you know, when this first raised its head, I remember being lobbied by a number of people that it really was a huge problem. I think we've taken quite a lot of steps to deal with it, but I'm happy to look further at whether there's more that can be done. Olaf, you might want to come in on this.
Just, as Foreign Secretary says, I think we are open to different options to look to address that. The visa issue is one that we've been around with the EU before in the context of the TCA negotiations, and I know your committee has looked into that before, and some of the parameters that limit that on the EU side remain in place. There are also other issues that you allude to, Chair, around cabotage, where some of the debate is tied to and locked to an internal EU debate around the way that cabotage works, and I think it's unlikely that the EU would want to offer a more generous cabotage arrangement to a third country than it would internally. But does that mean we wouldn't like to keep going further? No, we absolutely would. Indeed, we hosted the Trade Partnership Committee under the TCA last week in London, and this was one of the issues we raised.
The cabotage issue means you can't put your musical instruments in one lorry and take it to 3 different EU countries without an enormous pile of red tape. So thank you. I appreciate that very much. Could we then come to...
Sorry, could I just follow on?
Lord,
on the trade... the schools.
Yeah.
It was extremely welcome that the Anglo-French agreement has now come into force, as was announced by the Home Office this week. But if I understood it from what the Minister said in our House at the time that this was first discussed, we are open to doing the same thing with the other member states. Are we proactively telling the other member states that this sort of deal, which involves accepting for school visit purposes ID cards, is on offer to all of them, because that is what we were told?
We're very interested in talking to other member states about it and getting it done that way. I don't want to give too effusive an answer, otherwise suddenly it'll turn into an EU competence and we'll be back into that whole debate. That's from not from our point of view, it's from their point of view. But fundamentally, yes, we have lots of agreements with different countries around the world about different forms of mobility for coming to work or coming to study and all the rest of it. And you know, that's very much our approach. We should continue to do that.
Yes, but I mean, if you look at the figures, they are pretty horrifying. The figures of what school visits were like before we left the European Union and what they're like now. And I don't know if you've had a chance, but perhaps you would have a chance to look at that. They are terrible.
I'm happy to go and have a look, but I think, as I say, we want to solve this on a bilateral basis.
Yes, that's
very good. Thank you. Lord Little, on green issues and
Yes.
energy.
Well, you've already spoken warmly about the need for cooperation on cross-channel grids and having electricity pricing arrangements and all that, which enable us to take full advantage of the opportunities here. But the Commission and Franz Timmermans, when he was Vice President, has, in his climate change policy, put forward the proposal for CBAMs, for carbon, you know, the tariffs that represent the carbon content of the import. And I think it's the case that Jeremy Hunt has said that in principle we think this is quite a good idea as well. So there's a sort of potential there. But does the government believe that it should be striking an agreement with the EU on CBAMs? And how do we overcome the problem that for some reason I don't understand, we've allowed our trading system to diverge from the EU, so that there's a bit of a problem in actually making it possible without getting into familiar arguments about are we unfairly getting some advantage or not. So is this an area where you think that we might be able to make progress?
It's difficult to answer this one right now because there's a government consultation going on right now about how we respond to the issue of CBAM and indeed the differential carbon pricing between between us and the EU. So this is being examined at the moment. I think you summarised it very well, but I can't really get ahead of it. But I'm looking at it carefully.
Right. Nothing more to say.
I'm afraid not.
Thank you very much. Baroness Lang.
Thank you very much, Foreign Secretary. This topic, I hope, is last but not least. Obviously, data protection is not, a departmental responsibility for you, but rather like the way Lord Hannay earlier flagged the ECHR, the question of protection of rights and freedoms is a theme which underpins a lot of the cooperation under the TCA. And in a report from a few weeks ago from the European Parliament, one of the major preoccupations of the Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs, which I long sat on, was about data protection, and the current data protection and digital information number 2 bill. And the worry, they expressed deep concern about this bill, that it's of the utmost importance that the UK ensures that the level of protection is essentially equivalent to that afforded by the EU. Very worried about the serious risk of onward transfer of data to countries which do not provide an adequate level of protection. Now, obviously, we have a data adequacy decision from the Commission, and this enables not only hugely important business data flows, so it's not just an arcane civil liberties question. It's a very important commercial issue, as well as the exchange of data in law enforcement, such as under the PRUM agreement. And so, there is a kind of big cloud looming, and just to think of the processes that will happen next year after the European elections, of course, the European Parliament has to approve the new commissioners. And I can, having sort of been there, done that, I can just foresee the hearings for the Justice and Home Affairs Commissioners when former colleagues of mine will be pinning the Commission down on this question of the adequacy of UK data protection for ensuring the continuation of the data adequacy decisions, which will be running out, and anyway the Commission they can be cancelled anyway. So I just wondered if this is on your radar in a very important way.
It is absolutely on my radar, and I mean, you describe it very well, but what I'd add is that, look, it's important we have the data adequacy recognition from the EU. That is important. But it's also important that we recognise that having left the EU, there's some flexibility. And, my general shtick here is where there's some flexibility, which we can work to our national advantage, whether it's in the way we regulate insurance, the way we regulate banking, the way we decide we're going to license new drugs, or we're going to run clinical trials, or any number of things where we want the best outcome for our country, we want to build our businesses, help our entrepreneurs, grow our industries, grow jobs. Where there's a margin to do things that suit us and work for us, we should take that. And on data, that's what the bill before both houses of Parliament is all about, is that, GDPR is important, but I think every time we switch on our telephones, we realise that, there's quite a lot of extra complicated bureaucracy, not all of which is necessary. So if there's an opportunity to make some adjustments that work for us, then we should take them. Now, I don't think in any way that should threaten our data adequacy, because, of course, there are lots of other countries that do have data adequacy nominations from the EU, as it were, that have very different data rules to us. So I think the argument I'd make if I was in those meetings with the Commissioner would be to say, yes, of course, look at the UK's new arrangements, but do remember that, you should also be thinking about New Zealand and Japan and Canada. They've all got data adequacy from the EU, but they've all got quite different and divergent ways of dealing with it. So let's not diverge for the sake of it, but if there's some things we can do that lessen bureaucracy, that help business, that help our entrepreneurs, let's do those things. And let's make sure we've got the very best arguments to say, yes, we've made some changes, but we're still, if anything, closer to you than Japan or New Zealand or all these other countries that you say are data adequate.
If I may just follow that up, I mean, you're perfectly right, Foreign Secretary, in that it's, it's not the form, it's the substance, and that the issue is whether there is equivalence of standards.
Yes.
So it doesn't mean to say that every I and T have to be dotted and crossed in exactly the same way. But, the fear is that this is watering down the quality of protection, this bill. And what I really want to ask you is the government absolutely sure that this bill, if it goes through in the form that it's been put to Parliament, will not water down such that there is a risk of losing the equivalence decision? And does the government believe that that is a risk worth taking?
Well, first of all, we want high standards in terms of data protection and data management. That's absolutely right. But I think what we need to look at is always the substance rather than the form. That's the key here. So that's point one. But point two, to answer your question very directly, we absolutely think the bill is consistent with being judged data adequate by the EU. And it's important that gets debated in both houses properly, but we're very confident. And I think the thing to bear in mind is this point about the other countries that have different ways of doing it, but are still judged data adequate. Now, we are a third country, so we should be treated like them, not like anything else by the EU.
Thank you. Baroness Nicholson, you wanted to follow up?
A side comment. Given that AI is not yet regulatorable, is it possible that we as a highly innovative nation might get right out in front by doing extra research on this? It's simply not controllable at the moment, and it probably never will be, but therefore we have to think different.
Yes, I've got a sympathy with that view. I was preparing for this meeting, I was sort of looking into this issue, and I noted actually what you said, Chair, about the EU's gone ahead and legislated on AI, and I'm a little bit scared. We're still trying to understand exactly what the risks are, and I think that sometimes if you rush into regulation, you might not get it right. I mean, all credit to the Prime Minister for the Bletchley Park Conference, for the work that's being done. I think let's try and end up with the right regulation. I mean, it may well be that EU regulation is a good piece of law, but I would be looking in myself at things like AI for facial recognition. Is there the right carve-out for national security to help keep us safe from terrorism and all the rest of it? I don't know. I just ask the question. Is the way they're going to regulate, is it really risk-based, or is it stopping particular technologies in every area? I don't know, but I would be asking that question. So again, it comes back to this thing about big enough to matter, small enough to be nimble. I totally cribbed this off the head of Spotify when he came to speak the other day on exactly this sort of topic. He's worried about the way he's being regulated as against Apple and digital gateways, and someone asked him a question, well, does it really matter what the UK says about this? And he said, it absolutely does. You are big enough to matter, small enough to be nimble, and what your regulators decide and the laws you pass can have a real impact, as they have with some of the competition policy arguments about Microsoft and what have you. So I think that's the right way to think about it. I'm sure we'll have to legislate on AI, but let's do the research, do the work, get it right, maybe learn from what the Europeans have got right, what they've got wrong, but I wouldn't be 100% confident they've got it right when they've legislated so quickly.
Thank you. Sorry, Baroness Nicholson.
Just to follow up.
Sorry, just one more from Baroness Nicholson.
Just a real quickie to say that the difficulty is with AI at the moment, and nobody quite knows how to control that, is when you put something in, they don't know where it's going to come out. Yeah. You can't regulate if you can't actually track something. All I am suggesting is that we're a very innovative nation. We should put more research into this. Yes. It might come out at the right end in advance of everybody else, which would be really good.
I think the great thing about the Bletchley Conference is that it's not just us researching it. There's going to be we're leading a sort of global movement to do that, and hopefully we can make the most of that.
Does it not, Foreign Secretary, emerge from this very useful exchange, which you've contributed a lot, on data protection, that we do need a dialogue with the people who are doing the regulation in the European Union of a continuous kind about this, so that we don't inadvertently trip up over each other or do something that leads to friction? Are we using those channels of dialogue in as full a way as we possibly could?
Well, of course, the AI summit was a classic example where the EU...
I was talking about the data protection.
Yeah, data protection.
Yes.
Yes, look, I think we need to think very carefully about how we are trying to take some burdens off but be high standards and effective. And we need to look at what the EU rules are. We need to look at what other countries that are judged data adequate are doing. And we can have that. There's nothing to stop us having that dialogue anytime we want to. You can always pick up the phone and talk to people in the Commission or elsewhere to have that conversation. It doesn't. I mean, again, right back to the beginning. it doesn't need to have this enormous structure around it. It's a conversation we can have.
Well, that's why I use the phrase dialogue, because obviously
Yes.
the autonomy of the two parties remains intact. But it's just a question, is the dialogue taking place?
I'm not fully up to speed with all of the different committees that we have under the TCA, but I'm sure it's covered by...
We do. The TCA obviously has the data adequacy framework attached to it. In that context, there is a regular dialogue, but I guess it speaks to the point that the Foreign Secretary made right at the start, that as well as that sort of, if you will, regularity of contact, there is also very informal and regular links. Yesterday, the relevant Director General from what's now DCIT was in Brussels talking about both AI and this issue. So that dialogue is happening.
Thank you.
Foreign Secretary, we've taken an awful lot of your time, and I promise to release you by 2:15. Can I just put one last question? Thinking back to the very important discussion you had with Baroness Nicholson about the challenge of our generation in gearing up on Ukraine and getting the defence industries working really well together across our countries, munitions, ammunition, other equipment. I personally am worried that when you look at the EU side, there is a sort of ecosystem where you have the European Defence Agency, you have the European Defence Fund, you have the PESCO projects process, and they are all set up in a way that is quite difficult for third countries to get involved. And so while this may be going on there, it's going on here, going on with the Americans, it's hard for us to get inside, as it were, this system in the EU on defence industrial cooperation. And I therefore just wonder whether that isn't worth another look, for example, to become an associate of the European Defence Agency, as the Americans have done, I think the Norwegians and Canadians, as a way in to that developing structure rather than being essentially outside it.
I haven't had a huge amount of time in my first month to go into this in detail, but my memory of the European Defence Agency was we weren't particularly keen on it when we were in the EU. And so I'm not fully inclined to fall in love with it after we've left. And of course, you make the point that if you do it as a third country... What?
We stopped it doing anything.
Well, no, but if you... Well, anyway, now, no, it was... We don't think it was always a good use of money. It wasn't very efficient. It wasn't very effective. And now, as a third country, if you work with it, there are all sorts of, as I understand it, IP and other restrictions that you would be disadvantaged by. So
it doesn't seem to stop the Americans wanting to participate, though. It's an interesting thing.
Well, I'm not sure that when you ask them, whether it's the best bit of the defence cooperation, they'd argue yes. I mean, my way of looking at it is NATO repeatedly tells its members that we need to not just do 2%, but look at interoperability, look at mobility, look at how we work together. That is the best forum, in my view, for working out how to effectively defend our interests in our continent. And, there, Britain has been an absolute leader with the joint task force that we lead, with the work we're doing, including right now in Estonia and elsewhere, in my view, for working out how to effectively defend our interests in our continent. And, there, Britain has been an absolute leader with the joint task force that we lead, with the work we're doing, including right now in Estonia and elsewhere. So I was always pretty sceptical of a lot of those European defence networks then, and I think we want a NATO-first policy even more now.
Thank you. Baroness Ludford, last word.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Foreign Secretary, it just occurs to me that perhaps when the UK was inside the EU, we had the privilege of stopping things that when we're outside we don't. Because we are more dependent on what is happening inside the EU, so we can't do anything about how the EDA works. But it's curious that the Americans and the Norwegians think it's useful to have an administrative arrangement, but the UK thinks that it doesn't need to bother because we didn't think a lot of the agency when we were inside.
Well, I mean, let me sort of back out and try and answer the sort of bigger question, which is that when you're in, you you kind of pay for all these things. So you pay for the European University Institute, you pay for your share of the Erasmus program, you pay for everything, right? And you balance off the things you think aren't very good with the things you think are good, and you have to pay for all of them. When you're out, one of the advantages is that you don't have to pay for the things that you don't think much of. And so, you know, I don't want to single out the European University Institute, but we never thought that was very good value for money, and so we're not going to pay for it now. So I'll make that point. You're obviously right. Of course, when you're in the EU, you can stop things that the EU is doing sometimes, and when you're out, you can't. But I would briefly, I'm not going to try and run down the clock, but remind you that when we were in 2011, and they produced a fiscal compact to support the single currency, which I said we needed a lot of safeguards because suddenly Eurozone countries were going to get together and talk about how to regulate financial services, and they said you can't have that. And I said, well, fine, I'm vetoing the treaty. And you'd think, well, you can veto a treaty, you can stop things like treaties. And it turned out that that wasn't the case at all. They produced this wonderfully named lawyer, Mr. Hubert Legal, I remember very well, who came out at about 2 in the morning and produced this book of EU rules and blew the dust off it and said, well, although there's been a veto, we're going to go ahead and do this treaty anyway.
Very creative.
And so they're very creative people. So don't believe you can always stop things when you're in. It's just the final coda I would add to that, because that proved you couldn't.
Foreign Secretary, that's a very good place, I think, to bring this to an end. Thank you so much for your time and for going over such a wide set of ground so soon after taking on the appointment. We're very grateful indeed, and with that I will close the public session.
Thank you very much.
The proceeding has ended.